All right, so let's get into it. Some of the sources you sent over about the potential impact of a reelected Trump on American democracy, honestly, some of the stuff is kind of intense.
Yeah, it is heavy. But I think the most helpful way to look at this is less as trying to predict the future and more like understanding how specific tactics could be used. Some of these tactics that are outlined in these sources, how they could be used to manipulate government institutions.
Okay, so less about will this happen and more how could this happen?
Right.
Not so much doomsday prophecy,
Yeah.
but more like informed analysis.
Okay.
Right. We're talking about things like Schedule F and what happened over at Voice of America with Michael Pack.
Exactly. We'll get to those, but also a deeper look at this Project 2025, which is getting a lot of attention. Kash Patel's ambitions and this unnerving concept of using trauma against federal employees.
Trauma. Really? Okay, yeah. We definitely need to unpack all of that. Let's start with Project 2025. It sounds like the title of a dystopian thriller.
It does sound a little ominous. Right. It's essentially a roadmap created by the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank. It outlines how a potential second Trump administration could fundamentally reshape the federal government. The implications are pretty significant because it suggests that expertise and impartiality might be sidelined in favor of loyalty.
So, like, imagine a government where your job security is based on whether you're loyal to one person, not whether you're actually qualified for your job.
That's a pretty accurate picture of what's being suggested. And it's not just about filling positions with loyalists. Project 2025 goes further. It outlines strategies to weaken agencies like the EPA, potentially reinstate Schedule F, which, for those who aren't familiar, was an executive order that would have made it much easier to fire career civil servants. And there are even whispers about weaponizing agencies like the IRS to go after political rivals.
Hold on. Using the IRS to target people based on their political beliefs, that feels a little Nixonian. Like, haven't we learned from the whole enemies list debacle?
That's a valid concern. And it's not just theoretical. These sources provide real examples of how these tactics have been used in the past, and how they could be even more powerful in a second term. One key figure in Project 2025 is Russell Vought, who has openly advocated for a trauma doctrine for federal employees.
A trauma doctrine. Now, I'm curious and a little concerned. What does that even mean? Is this about actual psychological trauma inflicted on people?
Well, it's about deliberately disrupting the norms and processes of the federal workforce, discouraging dissent, incentivizing loyalty. Think about going to work every day and not knowing if you'll have a job tomorrow. If expressing any opinion that's even slightly outside the party line could cost you your livelihood, that constant fear and uncertainty can be incredibly damaging.
So not physical trauma, but the kind of trauma that makes people afraid to speak their minds or even do their jobs properly because they're worried about the consequences.
Exactly. And remember, this isn't just a theoretical concept. We've seen elements of this put into practice already. John McEntee, Trump's former head of personnel, was known for conducting loyalty tests and purging officials who were perceived as disloyal.
Yeah, McEntee, didn't one source mention something about him, like going through people's social media? Like, seriously, liking the wrong post could get you fired.
Absolutely. That level of surveillance and control within the federal government is a huge red flag. It's a classic authoritarian tactic. And this trauma doctrine that Vought advocates for aims to normalize that behavior, basically making fear and intimidation standard practice.
It's just mind-blowing that this is even on the table. Where does Kash Patel fit into all of this? The sources painted him as a pretty diehard Trump ally.
He's a key figure to understand because what he wants to do illustrates the potential consequences of these tactic roles.
I remember reading that he was pretty vocal about his, let's call it enthusiasm for going after anyone who criticized Trump, journalists included.
Right, and that's what's so concerning. Imagine an FBI director who sees the law as a weapon to use against political opponents, instead of a tool to protect the public. The potential for abuse is really frightening.
It's chilling to think about an FBI director who answers only to one person. Not the Constitution. Sounds like something out of a bad movie.
An honestly frightening figure. The sources you shared paint him as someone who seems willing to do whatever it takes to advance Trump's agenda.
Yeah, and that's what makes his potential role in a second Trump administration so concerning.
And Patel, well, he seems to be a key player in this.
Deeply involved. He's even listed in their personnel database, which has been described as a kind of conservative LinkedIn with over 10,000 names ready to be deployed across the government.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it?
It really is. It's like they're building an army of loyalists to take over the government.
And this isn't just hypothetical either. Trump has openly vowed retribution against his perceived enemies.
Okay, so let's unpack Kash Patel a bit more. The sources paint a picture of someone let's just say, whose loyalty to Trump seems to override any other consideration, even basic competence or ethical conduct.
Well, some might even say he's dangerous. Not necessarily for having a specific agenda, but because he seems to act solely to please Trump.
Which honestly might be even more dangerous.
Perhaps. And, even some of Trump's own appointees, people like Bill Barr and Gina Haspel, were completely opposed to giving Patel any real power.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They saw him as unfit, which is pretty damning coming from them.
So connecting this back to Project 2025, what are the potential consequences if this plan actually goes into effect?
Well, it's not just about changing policies. It's about, dismantling the entire system, the systems that are in place to ensure accountability and protect the public interest.
So weakening civil service protections, making it easier to fire people who aren't deemed loyal enough.
Right. Imagine a government full of people who are afraid to speak up, to challenge decisions for fear of losing their jobs.
A culture of fear and self-censorship.
Exactly. And then there's the question of expertise.
Right.
You're replacing experienced civil servants with political appointees who might have very limited experience.
It's like replacing surgeons with people who've only read about surgery in books.
Well, that's a bit of an extreme example.
Maybe, but you get the point. They might be enthusiastic, but you wouldn't want them operating on you. It just feels like Project 2025 is more about ideology than competence, and that could have some pretty disastrous consequences. It suggests this might be bigger than just partisan politics. We could be talking about a real threat to the very foundation of American democracy.
When a single person's interests are prioritized over the good of the public and the institutions designed to serve the people are turned against them, that's when you know you're in dangerous territory.
And it's not just about abstract principles either. The potential for abuse of power has very real, tangible consequences. The sources talk about how agencies like the IRS, the EPA, even law enforcement could be weaponized.
It's chilling to think about.
The IRS could be used to target political opponents. The EPA could be manipulated to favor corporate interests over protecting the environment. Law enforcement could be used to silence dissent.
It's like something out of a dystopian novel.
It is. And it's not just speculation either. The sources point to historical examples of this kind of abuse, like the Nixon administration, using the IRS to go after its enemies.
It's a reminder that we're not immune to these kinds of threats, even in a country like the United States.
And then there's Kash Patel's stated desire to lead the FBI.
Oh, right.
The sources suggest that this is a real possibility in a second Trump administration, and, well, it's terrifying.
It is. Can you imagine someone with his history of loyalty to Trump, someone who has shown a willingness to target perceived enemies, being in charge of the FBI?
It doesn't even bear thinking about. Politically motivated investigations, prosecutions, it would completely undermine the FBI's mission, which is to uphold the law and protect the American people.
The FBI has always been seen as this nonpartisan institution, its agents and leaders prioritizing, upholding the law, regardless of politics.
Right. To have someone like Patel at the helm would be a complete betrayal of that tradition.
The sources even describe Patel explicitly threatening to come after journalists and political opponents.
It's chilling.
Chilling is the word. It sends a message that anyone who criticizes those in power could be targeted.
It's like a threat to anyone who dares to dissent.
And, the sources even suggest that under Patel, the FBI could be used to investigate completely fabricated cases, manufacturing scandals, just to target those deemed disloyal.
Wow.
It's a level of abuse that's hard to even fathom. It would turn the FBI into an instrument of political persecution.
And it's not just the FBI, right?
No, the sources suggest other law enforcement agencies could be manipulated as well. Imagine a situation where anyone who criticizes the administration for any reason could be targeted, investigated, maybe even prosecuted.
It would create a chilling effect across society. People would be afraid to speak out against those in power, even if they're acting illegally or unethically.
Exactly. That's how authoritarian regimes operate. They silence dissent and concentrate power in the hands of a few.
This isn't just about individual agencies being weaponized either.
Right. The sources are pretty clear that Project 2025 is about dismantling the administrative state altogether.
Which reflects a fundamental distrust of government itself, right? Like they believe that career civil servants are inherently opposed to the will of the people.
Exactly. It's this idea that government is the enemy, not a tool for serving the public good.
Okay, so defunding is one tactic. What else does this Project 2025 propose?
Another big one is undermining the independence of federal agencies, especially regulatory agencies like the EPA, the CFPB.
Right, we touched on that a bit earlier, but the sources really got into the nitty-gritty of how they might do this.
Well, one way is appointing loyalists to head these agencies, people who put the administration's agenda ahead of the agency's mission. We saw this during Trump's first term, Scott Pruitt at the EPA, Mick Mulvaney at the CFPB.
Yeah, those are pretty controversial appointments. Critics said they were more interested in deregulation and helping industry than protecting the environment or consumers.
Exactly. And the sources suggest that a second Trump administration could be even more aggressive, appointing people with even weaker qualifications and a clearer mandate to dismantle their own agencies.
It's like they want to put people in charge who will actively sabotage the very agencies they're supposed to lead.
Yeah, that's the concern. And it's not just about personnel either. They can use budgetary pressure to limit agencies' ability to function. We talked about defunding, but they can also withhold funding for specific programs they don't like.
So agencies are forced to prioritize certain areas over others.
Right. They can't really act independently. The sources also talked about using executive orders to achieve similar goals.
Oh yeah, executive orders. Trump was a big fan of those.
Right. Basically, directives from the president that have the force of law, bypassing Congress entirely.
And the sources suggest a second Trump administration could use these executive orders to really go after regulatory agencies. Weaken their authority, limit their ability to enforce rules, just overturn policies they don't like.
It's essentially governing by fiat. They just bypass Congress, ignore the checks and balances that are supposed to be in place.
Yeah, it raises serious concerns about abuse of power.
It does. I mean, executive orders can be a legitimate tool sometimes, but when they're used to undermine the rule of law, that's when they become a real threat to democracy.
Okay, so defunding, appointing loyalists, budgetary pressure, executive orders, anything else?
Oh, there's more. This next one is pretty insidious. They talk about using the legal system to, sabotage the bureaucracy.
Wait, using the courts to attack the government? How does that work?
Well, they point to the Supreme Court's decision to overturn the Chevron deference doctrine.
To be honest, I don't really remember what Chevron deference is all about.
Basically, it meant that courts had to defer to an agency's interpretation of a law. As long as Congress hadn't specifically addressed the issue and the agency's interpretation was reasonable, it was meant to prevent courts from second-guessing expert agencies.
So it was a way to protect agencies that have specific expertise from being undermined by the courts.
Exactly. But the Supreme Court overturned Chevron deference back in 2024, which shifted power from agencies to the courts.
And that's where the sabotage comes in.
Right. Without Chevron deference, courts are free to substitute their own judgment, even on really technical or scientific matters. So a court that's sympathetic to a rogue administration could just invalidate regulations, block enforcement actions, basically cripple agencies.
It's like having a bunch of art critics telling a team of surgeons how to perform an operation.
It's a good analogy. And the sources suggest that this is exactly what Project 2025 aims to do. Empower the courts to second-guess and overturn decisions made by agencies.
Basically giving the judicial branch veto power over the regulatory process.
Right. And then you add to that the potential for a rogue administration to appoint judges who share their ideology, and it gets even scarier.
Yeah. Stacking the deck. If you control the judiciary, you control the outcome.
It really highlights the importance of an independent judiciary. When judges become tools of the executive branch, the rule of law breaks down, and that opens the door to tyranny.
Yeah, it seems like this is becoming more and more common. It's a worrying trend.
It is. If we allow the courts to be weaponized like this, it'll have a chilling effect on the ability of governments at all levels to protect the public interests.
So we've got defunding, appointing loyalists, budgetary pressure, executive orders manipulating the courts. Is there anything else in their playbook?
Well, yeah, actually, there's one more tactic they discuss, and it's often overlooked. Psychological warfare.
Psychological warfare. What does that even mean in this context?
Basically, using propaganda, disinformation, intimidation to demoralize government workers, make people distrust government institutions, create a climate of fear and suspicion.
So it's not about directly attacking agencies, but about eroding public trust in them.
Exactly. They want to paint government as the enemy, incompetent, corrupt, a threat to individual liberty.
And a lot of this is fueled by conspiracy theories, misinformation, like that whole deep state thing that was so popular during Trump's first term.
Oh, yeah, the deep state. That's a perfect example. You create this narrative where career civil servants are the villains, they're disloyal, they're working against the president, they're even a threat to democracy itself.
And then you use that narrative to justify purges, loyalty tests, all sorts of measures to weaken the civil service and consolidate power.
Right, and the sources also pointed to right-wing media as playing a key role in spreading this narrative, creating hostility towards government workers, portraying government as this bloated, inefficient entity, a threat to freedom, a tool of the liberal elite.
Yeah, that kind of rhetoric can really shift public opinion, make it easier to attack the bureaucracy.
And it can also target specific individuals within the government.
Like Dr. Fauci. He faced constant criticism, even death threats, for advising the government on COVID-19.
Exactly. They want to silence dissent, make experts afraid to speak truth to power.
It's dangerous because it undermines good governance. You need experts to make good decisions.
Absolutely. It extends to putting loyalists in positions throughout the government, including agencies that control information and communication.
Wait, are we talking about turning government agencies into propaganda machines? Is this like what happened with Michael Pack and Voice of America?
Yeah, that's a key example that comes up in these sources. Pack was accused of trying to transform Voice of America, which is supposed to be an unbiased source of news for international audiences. He tried to turn it into a platform for pro-Trump messaging. There were reports of him purging staff, suppressing any critical coverage, basically trying to turn the agency into a mouthpiece for the administration.
Didn't he even try to put a pro-Trump commentator in charge of the VOA's Urdu language service, even though the guy had zero journalism experience?
That's right, and that's just one example. The sources suggest a broader strategy to control information, potentially by placing loyalists in key roles throughout the government, including agencies that manage communication and information dissemination.
So not just silencing dissent within the government, but controlling the information that reaches the public. It's like a 1-2 punch. Dismantle the institutions that hold power accountable, then manipulate the information people get to control the narrative. It's pretty chilling.
It is, and it's important to connect this back to Project 2025. While Trump has publicly distanced himself from the project, the actions of his appointees and the policies he promoted during his first term reveal a clear pattern. The sources argue that regardless of whether he explicitly endorses Project 2025 or not, the foundation has been laid for it to potentially be implemented.
So even if it's not a direct order, the ideas are out there, the groundwork has been done, and the people who could make it happen are already in place.
Precisely. And that's why it's so crucial to understand this. We're not talking about abstract what-ifs. These are real tactics that have been used before, and they could easily be brought back.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. We've got Project 2025, which lays out a pretty extreme vision for changing the government. We've got people like McEntee and Patel who seem to embody this loyalty above all else mentality. And we've got examples like Michael Pack at Voice of America that show how these tactics can play out in the real world. It's a lot to process, and to be honest, it's kind of scary.
It is unsettling, but I think before we get too overwhelmed, it's important to remember that understanding these tactics, seeing how they all connect, is the first step in resisting them.
Knowledge is power.
Right.
So how do we go from just understanding these tactics to actually doing something about them?
That's what we'll explore next. Because these sources don't just lay out how these tactics could be used, they also offer insights into potential points of resistance.
Okay, that's good to hear. Because right now, it feels like we've fallen down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how we get out.
I get it. But there's more to this story. These sources offer some potential paths forward, ways to push back against these trends and protect the integrity of our democratic institutions. And that's where we'll continue our deep dive.
Thank you for listening to the Daily Mind Brew podcast. Democracy isn't a spectator sport. Check out the podcast summary for key takeaways and actions you can take to be a defender of democracy today. And now, back to the conversation.
So let's get into some specific examples of how this power grab could play out, based on what we've seen from Trump's first term. One of the sources goes into detail about the legal and structural changes that were attempted, some successfully, to undermine democratic norms. A prime example is that whole Schedule F executive order that we mentioned before.
Right, the one that would have made it way easier to fire career civil servants. It sounded pretty extreme.
It was, and it's something that could easily come back. This order, introduced by Trump back in 2020 but later revoked, would have reclassified thousands of federal employees, stripping them of civil service protections.
So it's basically like saying, hey, you've been doing this job for 20 years. You're an expert in your field. But we don't like your political views, so you're out.
Exactly. It gives the president a ton of power to purge agencies of anyone they see as disloyal, no matter how skilled or experienced they are.
It would be like replacing a bunch of experienced doctors with yes men who have no medical training at all. What a mess that would be.
That's a great analogy, and it doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
Think about agencies like the EPA, which rely on scientific expertise to protect the environment. The sources point to efforts during Trump's first term to weaken the agency, slashing their budget, replacing scientists with political appointees.
So you're not just firing people, you're gutting these agencies from the inside out.
That's right. And it goes way beyond just the EPA project. 2025 targets a bunch of agencies, including the ones responsible for protecting consumers, workers, and the environment.
So it's basically a systematic dismantling of the institutions that are supposed to protect the public good. Isn't this where that idea about using the IRS to target political opponents comes in?
Yeah, but it's even more insidious than that. The sources suggest that a re-elected Trump could manipulate federal grants and contracts, rewarding areas that support him while punishing those that oppose him.
Wait, so now you're not just going after individuals, you're punishing whole communities for their political beliefs.
Think about it. Imagine your state being denied funding for important infrastructure projects or disaster relief because your governor or senators disagreed with the president.
That's terrifying. It would create a system where you'd basically be forced to choose between your political views and the well-being of your community.
Exactly. And that's the danger here. These tactics undermine those basic principles of fairness and equal treatment under the law. It creates a two-tiered system where the people in power can reward their friends and punish their enemies, regardless of the needs of the people they're supposed to represent.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here, and it's not looking good. We're talking about loyalty purges, dismantling crucial agencies, using government resources for political revenge. Where does all of this lead? What's the end game?
The big picture, as the sources laid out, is a potential erosion of democratic norms and institutions. These tactics, if they were fully implemented, could weaken the rule of law, undermine checks and balances, and ultimately concentrate power in the hands of just one person.
So like a gradual slide toward authoritarianism.
You could say that. And what's even scarier is that these tactics aren't unique to Trump or to the U.S. Authoritarian leaders all over the world are using these same strategies to consolidate power and silence dissent.
So it's like a global playbook. Have any countries managed to resist these kinds of power grabs?
They have. And their strategies offer some important lessons for us. We're going to dive into those examples in the next segment, looking at how some countries have been able to push back against these trends and protect their democracies.
Okay, that gives me a little bit of hope, because right now I'm feeling pretty overwhelmed by all of this.
I understand. But remember, awareness is the first step. By understanding these tactics and seeing the patterns, we can start to identify potential solutions.
So what are some of those solutions? What can we learn from countries that have faced similar situations?
Well, one common thread is the importance of a strong and independent media. Think about how Michael Pack tried to turn Voice of America into a propaganda machine.
Right. It's chilling to think about the government controlling the narrative and shutting down any dissenting voices.
Exactly. That's why supporting independent journalism financially by subscribing or donating, and vocally by defending press freedom is so crucial. We need to call out disinformation and fight back against any attempts to weaken the free press.
So it's not just about staying informed ourselves. It's about making sure everyone has access to reliable information.
That's key. Another critical area is protecting the integrity of the civil service. Remember that whole Trauma Doctrine and the attempts to purge disloyal officials.
It's scary to think about talented, dedicated people being forced out of their jobs just because they aren't blindly loyal.
That's why we need to resist any attempts to politicize the civil service. We need to support reforms that protect whistleblowers and celebrate public service for the vital role it plays.
So it's about recognizing that these government employees, the ones who actually keep things running, aren't the enemy.
Exactly. They're public servants. And a healthy democracy relies on a strong and independent civil service.
Okay, so we've got supporting a free press, protecting the civil service. What else can we learn from other countries that have faced similar challenges?
Well, one strategy that's been effective in many cases is the power of coalitions, bringing together diverse groups of people who may not agree on everything, but who share a common goal of protecting democracy.
Strength in numbers, right?
Exactly. Because these threats aren't just targeting one group or one ideology. They're attacking the very foundations of our system. So it's going to take a united front to fight back. We need to build bridges, find common ground, and stand together to protect our democracy.
So it's about understanding that we're all in this together, no matter our political differences.
Exactly. We need to put those partisan squabbles aside and focus on the bigger picture, defending our democracy from those who would try to weaken it.
This is starting to feel a little less hopeless. So free press, strong civil service building coalitions. What's the most important thing for people to take away from all of this?
Don't give up. Don't let cynicism or despair take over. Democracy is a work in progress. It always has been. And it requires active participation from all of us.
So it's not enough to just be aware of the threats. We need to be actively involved in defending our democracy.
Absolutely. Vote, speak out, hold your leaders accountable, and never take your freedoms for granted.
I like that message. This has been a tough conversation,
Yeah.
but I actually feel more empowered than I did when we started. Knowledge is power, right?
That's right. And by understanding these tactics and recognizing the patterns, we can start to build a stronger democracy, one that can withstand these kinds of attacks.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. It's been a wild ride, but ultimately I think we've landed in a place of cautious optimism.
We hope so. The goal was to equip you with the knowledge and tools you need to navigate these challenging times. Stay informed, stay involved, and never underestimate the power of your voice.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And remember, the future is unwritten. It's up to all of us to shape it.